House at the End of Elm Street by Kit Williamson. I have often found myself wondering over the years why supernatural occurrences tend to happen more often in places with history. Perhaps the virtue of a place or object's age builds up a sort of energy that attracts those things that are not of this world. Or maybe it is simply that older locations have had more of a chance to accrue a history full of situations which are prone to create such things. I have seen many places like this over the decades, places that seem to have a life of their own. You don't usually have to look very hard to find such a place. In fact, you might be living next to one as you hear this. There are many such places like this around my hometown, some more malevolent and eerie than others. One such place we simply referred to as the House at the End of Elm Street. While this might seem to some like a cheesy reference to the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, I assure you they are not related in the slightest. When I was a kid, we did indeed live on Elm Street, and this particular house rested only a few blocks from there. Of the history of the house, none of us ever knew. Perhaps that was part of the appeal to us when we were younger. It stood 2 stories tall, constructed entirely of cobbled stone with the exception of the roof, which was nothing more than rotting wood planks sitting on top of the stone structure. By some virtue of fear, superstition, and luck, the house still retained its aged glass windows sitting inside their wooden frames. The only door remaining to the house was a plywood board set up in the doorway to keep animals or adventurous use outside of the residence. For as long as I, or anyone I know remembers, the house has always stood there. I have never talked with anyone who knew its history, but I have heard many stories surrounding the house. None so grisly as murders that occurred there, only tale of lights illuminating the second-floor windows and strange sounds heard from within. Every kid claimed to have seen or heard such at one time or another. My brother, our neighbor, and I often imagined what might be inside. Often we would dare each other to get as close to the house as we dared, rushing to touch the plywood that served as a door before racing away in abstract fear. It was on one such evening, shortly after sunset, that the 3 of us sat in front of the aged, creaking house, watching for signs of what spirit might lie within, when we decided as a group to enter the house and discover once and for all what lay inside. The 3 of us walked confidently up to the plywood, peeling it away from the gaping black hole that led inside. Being the youngest, I was unaware of what the other 2 had truly planned for the evening. With a laugh of malicious joy, my brother shoved me through the doorway as our neighbor grabbed the plywood, shoving it back in place and trapping me inside the dark. In terror, I picked myself off the dusty, rotted wood floor and began to pound on the plywood, screaming and begging for release. Instead of freeing me from the stony prison of the house, the 2 outside only continued to laugh, calling me crybaby and a slew of other names. Frustrated and unable to make my escape, I continued to plead with them to let me out. It was then that they struck a deal with me. If I was to go up to the second floor and flash my light from the window up there, they would agree that I was brave and allow me to leave. I set to the door with a fury, trying to push it out of my way, but with the 2 of them holding it in place, I had no chance of moving it. Resigned to my fate, but still shaking with terror, I walked away from the board, pulling my small flashlight from my pants pocket and raking it around the room. Through the dust floating around in the room I was in, I saw what appeared to be an old family room. A rotting table sat supported by 3 legs, the shattered remains of chairs surrounding it. From the stone fireplace, the wind whipped through the chimney, emitting an eerie whistle. Looking around the room eased my nerves some, as there was no horrors to be seen in this room. With only the whistling wind to keep me company, I began to explore, looking for the stairs that would lead me to the second floor, and hence to my salvation. I wandered several rooms whose purpose I could not understand without furniture to give context. Eventually, I came to a staircase, concealed behind what remained of an ancient door. The door let out a creaking, rusted scream as I began to push it out of the way, then promptly fell off the wall as the hinges that had lasted for who knows how long gave way, sending up a cloud of dust, which caused me to hack and blink my now burning eyes. As the dust settled, I was able to see the stairs with my watering eyes. The boards were old and weathered, many steps missing in places, and I eyed them with extreme trepidation. As a full-grown man looking back on this memory, I do realize, had I not been much smaller and lighter at the time, my journey would have ended there. However, as a child, I was able to gently plant my foot on the first step. It creaked in protest, sagging in the center and threatening to break. Given that there was no escape to the safety outside due to being trapped, in my child's mind I had no choice but to slowly ascend the treacherous planks leading up. With each step I feared I would come plummeting back to the bottom, and I could not tell if the tremor I was feeling was from my fear or the aged planks below me. I kept myself moving up, carefully setting my foot down and testing my own weight before ascending to the next step, a process that seemed to me to take several hours. Finally, on the landing of the second floor, I sat down on it, the boards groaning and creaking with every slight movement I made, and breathed in heavily. Dust still filtered through the beam of my flashlight as it illuminated an empty hall with 3 doorways inside. The doors themselves lay in splinters in the hallway, as if they had been kicked down from inside the rooms. Splinters and large chunks of wood decorated the floor, rotting and falling to pieces as they lay there, undisturbed by anything for unknown years. Having conquered what I thought at the time was the most difficult part of my quest, my breathing slowed to a more normal rate, and I picked myself from the dust of the floor. The boards that made up the floor of the hallway were just as decrepit as the rest of the house. Holes lay in places, looking like jagged mouths ready to take out a bite of a young adventurer, the splintered edges forming a ragged-looking set of teeth. As I made my way down the hallway to the first door, being very careful to avoid the yawning wooden maws, the floor sagged, threatening to give way even under my minuscule weight. I carefully made my way inside the first doorway, the mediocre luminance from my flashlight cutting through the dark. Amazingly, inside this room stood the remains of an old dresser, the dust of ages coating its surface, as well as the remains of a bed frame and what appeared to be the shattered pieces of a chair. Edging closer to the external wall, I was disappointed to discover that the window in this room had been boarded from the inside. This meant I would have to explore even further into the second floor to shine my light and secure my freedom from this nightmare. Sliding my feet along the floor, I moved back to the doorway, peeking around the corner and shining my light down the hall again. Shuffling my feet as I crept down the hall, I began to feel uneasy, the stress of moving so cautiously weighing heavily on my brain. I peered into the second room as I came to the doorway. My light met only with emptiness, with the exception of the dust motes floating past the beam. Panning my vision across the room, my eyes fell on a set of weathered old shutters securing the window in this room. As I stepped inside, a resounding crack echoed through the place as a board gave way under my foot. Narrowly avoiding falling completely through the newly opened hole, I fell backwards, landing with a heavy thump and more creaking on the boards. It was at this point that I decided that going into this second room was most probably a bad idea, indeed, given the state of the floor, and scooted backwards into the hallway. And so I was left with only one final option to choose from. The door at the end of the hallway lay in the same state as its brothers. I slid along the hall, keeping my back to the wall, and watching the gaping holes in the floorboards. The distance between myself and the final door seemed to stretch, as if I was not in fact moving, but standing in place as the door retreated from me. Eventually, I made my way to that distant portal, hoping against all odds that I would finally be able to secure my release. Peeking around the doorway, I was greeted by a sight both wonderful and terrifying. Instead of the derelict furniture I had witnessed throughout the house, this room was in pristine condition. A luxurious bed lay to one wall, covered in a fluffy down comforter. Across from that, an antique oak dresser stood proudly, the large silver mirror mounted on top of it reflecting the light of my flashlight and scattering it around the room. Forgetting for the moment the terrors of the rotting floors in the other rooms, I was held in rapt attention by this mirror. Step by step, it drew me closer until I stood directly in front of the dresser. There I stood, transfixed, eyes wandering over the image the mirror presented to me. First noticing the oil lamp lit next to the window, sitting upon a sturdy nightstand. How had I not noticed this upon first entering the room? Pondering this conundrum, I continued to look into the silver portal when movement caught my eyes. At first, I doubted that I had seen it, that my eyes were playing tricks on me. But as I continued to watch, the comforter adorning the bed stirred and slowly began to pull down from the headrest. Focusing on this strange happenstance, it came to me that the blanket was not, as I had first thought, moving itself. Instead, my eyes came to rest on a delicate feminine hand resting on the top of the bedding. Glancing up as the hand continued to push the blanket down, my eyes were greeted by a beautiful young woman. Straight blonde hair cascaded down over her shoulders, framing a pair of azure blue eyes, full lips, and a narrow face. She sat up in bed with a look of shock and fright on her face, eyes opening wide. I froze in turn, not wanting to frighten her, my brain not catching up to the incongruity of the situation. Thoughts raced through my head as I continued to stare at her through the mirror, heart racing as I broke out into a cold sweat. We both remained still, eyes locking through the reflection provided by the surface of the mirror. Her mouth closed slowly, replaced by a pleasant smile as she moved her legs off the side of the bed, the light of the lamp shining off her pale skin. A shimmer played off the silken nightgown she wore as she stood up slowly, her bare feet not making a sound as she planted them on the wooden planks of the floor. She raised a finger to her lips as she started to move closer to me, encouraging me to remain silent. I continued to watch as she seemed to glide along the floor, taking each step with an ethereal grace I had never seen. Upon reaching the floor directly behind me, she stopped, our eyes still locked together through the mirror. Her arms moved then, gently wrapping me in an embrace from behind. An icy chill raced through me wherever our skin met. Pulling herself against me, my body shivered as if I was swimming in ice water, and it became hard to breathe. And still our eyes remained locked through the vision granted by the mirror. Icy limbs slowly encircled my waist as we gazed at one another. Cold, clammy skin brushing against mine, causing me to shiver. Her breath came out across the side of my head like an arctic breeze, sending a wave of cold down my spine. Slowly, I regained my senses, battling against the wrongness that was surrounding me. Turning slowly around, sliding along the frosty grip of the woman, I lost sight of her reflection. As I turned to look upon the young woman, my look of admiration was quickly replaced by that of horror. No longer standing before me was the beautiful vision I had seen in the mirror. Sallow, graying skin now covered her face, sagging down as if it was an adult's dress worn by a toddler. My gaze rose to meet the horrible abomination that was the thing's face. Where those beautiful lips were now shone a gaping maw, open wide to display rows of broken, ragged, yellow rotting teeth. My eyes met where hers should be, but instead of eyes I was greeted by an empty void, two black holes burning where her eyes should be. I opened my mouth and let out a terrified scream, and the thing's mouth opened wider, letting loose a banshee wail that drowned my meager voice out. With a loud crack, the lantern on the nightstand exploded, sending fragments of glass out from it and plunging the room into darkness and silence. Suddenly released from that terrible embrace, I found my feet again, sprinting out into the hallway as if all the demons of hell were at my heels. My flight from that place is still hazy in my mind. I flew past the gaping floor maws and almost fell down the stairs 2 at a time, shrieking as I went, tripping over wooden remains and falling flat on my face several times before getting back up and continuing my mad dash. I was well out of the house and onto the opposite side of the street before I even realized it. Looking back, I noticed the plywood blocking the door lay on the ground, and my brother and friend were nowhere to be found. Down the street, I could hear their distant yelling as they both sprinted back to our house on Elm Street. I eventually made my way back as well, but not without a feeling of trepidation. Even if I was to tell them the story, there was no way they would believe what I had witnessed. When I got home, I told them I had stepped on a nail, and that was the source of my screaming. The house at the end of Elm Street still stands to this very day, lurking at the corner, cobblestones holding the place erect. Maybe someday they will tear it down, but for now, there it stands. I still see it from time to time when I go back home to visit, and it always brings a shudder down my spine. And on rare occasions, when there is no one around, I still see the lantern burning in that second-story window. I still see that beautiful woman standing behind the lantern, barely visible. And I still hear that wail of despair and malevolence echoing off the night winds in the cold mountain air. Thank you for listening. This is the third story from the upcoming anthology that I am in the process of writing. I wish I could give you more of a set date when it will be released. But for now, I hope you enjoyed. I will be posting more of them as they come up and I get them recorded, of course. Thank you again for listening, and please remember to like and subscribe. Stay creepy, my fiends.